Okay, so stream quality is not very good right now, but at least this way I can get y'all a 60 FPS video. Uh, I have some coding that I have to do. The game is coming along well enough, but we have some problems with the build speed. The I actually created like a little graph program that will show us how the build time has skyrocketed. Right. Um, we're now seeing 3.5 seconds for a build, which is absolutely fucking ridiculous. And this is all due to the way that I began packing assets. I realized, oh shit, this is probably not the way. So at some point, not immediately, I'm gonna have to go back and rewrite shit so that I'm not packing things in the way that I'm currently packing them, which is suck for me, but it is what it is. And sometimes you have to do this. Sometimes you run into situations where you have to backtrack and realize, oh, I really shouldn't have actually deleted that code that loaded stuff from disk. So my bad, no big deal. We'll fix it. But on to the actual agenda, which is actually doing a little bit of stuff with combat. And previously, I had implemented a game locking mechanism so that, like, after the player took their turn, there's a lock step that I do where the player's move gets registered and animated, and then immediately after that, there's a pause of about like 30 to 60 seconds or some, sorry, 30 to 60 frames, followed by the enemies taking their turn. So I've disabled that at the moment, but it's resulting in kind of a weird behavior of the enemies. So when I spawn one enemy at the moment, because I don't have it locking as per waiting for like user input in order to enumerate their turns, it's just spamming the enemy turn and they're just going crazy, moving rapidly, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. So we need to fix that first before I can do anything with combat. I want to do some combat stuff tonight before I go to bed. I was going to stream it, but I was getting a fuck ton of dropped streams at the beginning of the stream, so I decided I might as well just make this an actual video. It's been a while since I've posted anything, and I want to actually make a regular effort to synchronize my development with actually posting content. So that way you get a map of the journey along the way once the final product actually does come out, whenever that's going to be. Um, but as it is, there's going to be so many assets in this game. I'm going to have to figure out some really good asset management strategy, because I'm not sure that even backtracking to loading things off disk is going to be sustainable in the long term. So with that in mind, um, let's go to update game state. And why is this not locking again, right? Um, I think what we have to do here, let's see. So originally we had this like just right here doing its thing. Um, player input received. Let's take a look at where those are located. In the very beginning of this video, I'm exploring my code base in order to backtrack and see why uncommenting, or rather commenting what I did out, has had the effect that it does. Because ideally, we don't want the enemies to move at all if the player input has not been received. So movement, attacking, these all currently act as a register for player input received. And at first, it's not going to be clear. It isn't clear exactly why this behavior is occurring, but we're probably only a 1 or 2 line difference away from it working correctly again. So this is effectively the same code as this up here. And handle NPC, like we only want to do this afterwards, right? That might be it. So instead of processing it infinitely in a loop before the player's made a turn or anything, we only want to do that after the player's actually provided some input. And actually, what's going to end up happening is, like, in order to do the incremental, like, each entity moves one at a time that I want to do, instead of this, like, global, like, glob movement where all of the entities are moving all at the same time, I'm going to have to restructure how this works, essentially. Effectively, like, we're going to have to find a way to trap these functions in a way that only one entity gets incremented through and processed at a time. Because like, the whole reason we do process turn here after we receive player input, because every frame we are constantly checking to see if we need to, like, update the entity smooth move, and smooth move only results in a sprite movement if there are, like, mod values on the sprite group. So, like, that don't, like the sprite group only gets, like, an update to those values if the player's moving or doing something. And so, like, every frame process turn only gets hit once, but, like, let's say you move right once, so, like, 8 pixels, one tile. The because this is update game state, and this gets called every frame. So update smooth moves gets called every frame, but when you move, process turn only gets hit once. So effectively, like, what we're going to need to do is have a function outside of this, or rather find a, we're going to probably have to re-implement the lock system to prevent the player from like inputting while other entities are like acting out their turn. But excuse me. So we're going to have some index into the entity ID list in order to like keep track of which entity's turn we're currently processing, because process turn is what actually updates, like I actually learned a new NeoVim keystroke here, control back brace. So process turn actions steps through the contents of the Lua and gets each available action and its associated ID, as well as the associated XY direction. And then we call a Lua we pass those values to a Lua function called process action. Actually acts on the game state inside of Lua. We get the result for that, and depending on the result, depends on how we update the sprite group. So if the action type was none, then there's no update to the sprite group. Like, it's not moving anywhere, so we can pass direction none to it. But if we're moving, for instance, then we would want to do this. Otherwise, if it's some other action like an attack, then we want to get the XY direction from the action, calculate the effective direction enum value, and then pass that to the update sprite group, so that it correctly positions the sprite in the right direction. So like, what we want to do is create a lock step. So before I do that, let's make sure that that change actually did what I want it to. I feel confident that it did, but let's just test it out and see. Alright, so regular movement. Now let's put an enemy on the screen. Now, he should not move until I move. So that's good. So this is effectively where we were at, like, maybe a week ago-ish. So I can spawn a ton of enemies. I got the camera following our dude again. I feel like that might be the best way to present the game. Now, I've got a bunch of tiles that are not loading properly because I've changed a lot of the values in our tile type.h file and inside the Lua itself. And I haven't imported everything. As you can see, it's, we attempted to randomly generate a certain set of these tiles, and it's very upset about this. As you can see, all the errors, right? So I wonder if I could do this without doing a hard reload of the game. So let's take out the Lua file, and there's like randomize dungeon tiles, and so this will actually generate a random type from dirt to stonewall. Now, the reason that we're getting a lot of the empty black tiles is that I have a bunch of new tile types here that I haven't actually imported assets for yet. And one of the motivations for going back and changing the tiles is or changing how I read the tiles in and all of the other assets back to on disk, is that I have a lot more tile types that I want to actually, you know, start throwing in here besides this. So I have to have a system to like ease that burden of getting all of these assets in here. I didn't realize how big asset management was going to be in actually doing this, but here we are. So now that we got that working again, I should probably check my code in. Okay, next. What are we doing next? Attacking, right? Combat. Let's take a look at how things are currently working. So back to update game state. We can actually temporarily disable and make the enemies very stupid. They no longer get a turn. So see how long it fucking takes to build now? Goddamn. So let me place some enemies down. These are gonna be my training dummies. At the moment, things kind of work as intended, but there's no actual underlying damage calculation or anything like that going on. We have no cool HP minus pop up or anything to indicate that the enemy's been damaged or how much that they've been damaged for or anything like that. We have no messaging in the system yet. We're going to get back there. But at the moment, we hit the dude, does that. And actually, so I just turned off my keyboard mouse so that I could use the numpad again. So directions actually work. So I just moved upright. So he's facing upright. Hit A button. Completely skip over that dude in the middle, indicating that my system is working as intended. So what do we do next? So one thing I realized that I need to do before we get really deep into, you know, combat stuff, and a lot of this is going to be nitty gritty details, but the way that I'm handling the damage animation at the moment is through the use of the sprite context system that I'm using. So you have all these different contexts that a sprite can be in, especially the humanoids. You have like idling, you have like damaged, you have like walking, you have attacking, you have all these different, you know, contexts that sprite group can be in. And the way that I'm switching to the damage sprite group, so for instance, a walk up, right, attack, up, right, attack. So that's just a flag, right? Like in the Lua part of the engine, was damaged is just a integer value on the entity itself. So when when the attack gets registered, we grab the entity that we've attacked and we set its was damaged to 1, and then the lib game checks to see if was damaged is 1 or not 0, and if it is, then we check to see which the race of the entity was, and if it was an orc, then we set the sprite group to be the orc damage sprite group. Otherwise, we're setting it to human, because at the moment we don't have a damage sprite group for the human. And before I can do any cool stuff like blocking, I'm gonna have to do that really annoying renaming and loading from disk of textures and all of that stuff. Which I'll probably record, but I'll like speed up so that y'all aren't like too bored by that shit. But I'm probably not doing that necessarily tonight. I'm just thinking out loud about how this works currently. So one of the things that we want is for the animation for the damage loop to like occur only once or twice, or some limited number, so that it resets back to the idle, especially if the enemy is still alive, right? So that's a pretty important detail that I want to smooth out before I continue on with like actual damage mechanics. So resetting the sprite animation context, I believe, is going to involve updating the definition of sprite groups. So the sprite group at the moment consists of a size, a capacity, a current, a move X, a move Y, an offset X, an offset Y, a destination rectangle, and a double pointer of sprites. So and actually I think context is not the right word that I want to use here. Because there's a difference between current and then context on a sprite, right? Which a sprite has a single texture that we point to, but to determine which part of the texture that we're actually drawing, because usually, for instance, like the human idle texture has 4 directions given in it: top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right. So that's one texture, and so like one sprite is going to refer to like that whole entity, but it could be facing any one of those directions, and which one we draw depends on the context, as in the current context. Which frame we draw is called current frame, and how many frames get drawn, we have num frames. How many contexts there are, so that's like the number of rows, right, in the texture for the sprite. So, and then the actual width and the height of the whole texture. So essentially just a wrapper, but it's a really useful way of looking at it, because for a sprite group, we can have all these different animations together by grouping each individual sprite. That's why we have a double pointer, because this is basically an array of sprites, and each sprite pointer is one sprite. So the destination essentially gets passed off into the sprites. So wherever this destination is at, that's where sprites actually get drawn. But what we want is for, like, for instance, the orc damage animation to only loop once and then reset back to a different current. So one way we could do this, and I'm just thinking out loud here, as I do in all my videos, one thing that we can do here is perhaps introduce a animation timer that will only like for a certain animation, we can set it up so that it only loops for a certain number of frames or a certain number of times through that animation. And then when it reset, like when it gets to the end of the animation, we can set it up to like switch back to a different animation, right? So one thing that we could do is introduce like a default. So like whatever, you know, it could, because the context doesn't have to change, but this would simply be another integer. So int default animation. And when we switch to the orc damage index, right, through entity animation set, when we do this, because this is a damage thing, we can introduce the timer, right? So like all this does is call sprite group set current. So all we would really have to do is have another function that modifies something on our sprite group, such as I mean, we wouldn't have to change the default animation, but we would need to set the default animation when we create the sprite group. So we need a int animation timer. So if we take a look at sprite, we have current frame and number of frames. So when the damage animation gets set, it has its own current frames and number of frames, because it's like one animation sheet. So you have 4 directions for that damage animation. Each one has its own, has the same number of frames. So if we wanted to like somehow signal upwards to the sprite group that this animation has like completed one loop, we would also have to update sprite in order to keep track of the number of loops that this sprite has gone through. Because then the sprite group would be able to reference the sprite, and we'd be able to check to see whether or not it's completed one loop. And if it has completed one loop, we don't even need a timer. So we could actually get away with not having this, and instead introducing num loops to the sprite itself. So this wouldn't help us, right? Unless we wanted to count that like 0 counted as one loop. So that would actually do that. So set context. If we change context, naturally we would want to do we want to keep the loops or the number of loops? Yeah. Okay, so that's all fine. So default animation, so we're just going to start it off with 0, and then when we go to actually sprite group create, so there's our hash table of sprite groups. Oh yeah, so we have a create sprite group by ID. Okay, so yeah, that gets called out in the process of creating entities. So depending on what entity we create would determine the default animation, right? So by ID, we actually handle or like split up by race, orc and human. So that's good because we pass that off to the create sprite group here. And right away after this, we can get the sprite group and then set the default animation for it, depending on what the player's is. You know what I mean? Let's see. What was the name of the sprite? Oh yeah, there we go. Human idol. Okay. So we pull out and set a default animation there, and then let's create a function to set the default animation. Libgame set default animation G or for ID. G ID oops. Game state G entity ID, and then int animation. No, not current, but default animation. So we have a new function. We need to put it into our .h file. So now we can call it. And so what we want to do is libgame set default. There we are. For G ID and then default. There we go. So now we would also have to trigger this reset, right? Because it's easy for us to keep track of the number of loops of how many times the sprite has looped itself. And it's easy for us to attach a default animation depending on which sprite that we've created. But now we have to put these two things together and basically write an if statement in the right location to basically see if one loop of the animation has occurred. And if it has, then we want to reset it. So we're going to want to have to do this for every entity in the dungeon, right? So it's possible that this is something that's done as part of a larger reset process. So like once the enemy has been done being damaged, like, because at the moment, like that's like stuck on. So like update entity damaged animation. Update entities damaged. It's called in the game state, right? So like I was saying earlier, it could be as part of that process. So like update entities damaged and then update entity damaged. So we could probably find a way to wedge it in here. If the index ends up being -1, that means that we passed in an invalid race, but this also doesn't take into account like whether or not it's completed that damage loop, nor do we reset was damaged anywhere at the moment. I mean, I have like a key press to do it, but this is part of that whole, like, once it completes, we want to not only update the fact that like we don't want the damage animation to do more than like one loop, but also we want to update the game state so that the entity is no longer considered as having been damaged, because it only really matters for purposes of updating the animation to begin with. So that in mind, so an easy thing to test would be to write code to handle the else case for was damaged, because Okay. So notice that the index is on both. Notice how this code's very similar. I would like to find a way in the future to separate out like the context of the fact that like we want the walking sprite group, but like we want to group like all of those things with human, right? Um, but we'll get there. So this will do entity animation set. This will do set current. Set current. If we pass in like something that's too big or negative, it'll set it at 0. So there's not going to be a crash or anything. Oh. So actually other than that, we want to have a check to see if an animation loop has occurred. Let's see. Actually, was it game state? Yeah, get sprite group. And then if group is it just sprite group? Oh, it's probably called something else, right? Oh, hash table entity ID sprite group get. There we go. It's not the current that we want to set. I want to set the. Actually, it is the current, but we want to set the current to the default. And actually, we would prefer to use a set current function. Sprite group, set current group, and then SG pointing to defaults. Now, set current, like I said before, if we pass it a negative, it'll set it to like whatever the default is anyway. So like there's no risk of like crashing on our end so long as we actually have something loaded up. Now, this does like a hard reset. This actually doesn't like check the loop. Because the loop is going to be different depending on like which animation you're currently on, right? Like which sprite you're currently animating. So like for instance, you could be idling and end up with like 10 loops, but then you switch over to the damage animation, it loops once, and then we want to go back to idling, right? So if the animation current, the sprite group animation, is damage, like work damage, then when I get the number of loops for that sprite. So in the sprite group itself, we can get an individual sprite from the sprite group given the index, so whatever the current animation index is. We can even mod this by hold on to that idea. But we can use the get to get the sprite anyway. So during the reset on loop, we get the sprite group, and if we get the group, we want to get the current sprite from the group and check its loop count. And we only want to do this if it's a damage animation. So like so first we get the current from the group if it exists, and then if current equals sprite group animation human, no, we'll just do orc damage, then we want to get the current sprite check its loop count. But we actually have a sprite group get, and then if sprite hold on, I gotta itch my ear. Fuck. Num loops. Well, instead of set current, we're going to use libgame entity animation set. But we could just use set current because we already have the group here. And that'd be, you know, kind of like less, because then we wouldn't have to like poll for the same group twice, because that's all set, you know, animation does. So, and this would only do it if it's on the orc damage animation. So now we need a place to actually call this, right? So like this whole function doesn't ever call or make, it doesn't like ever get the sprite group. But up here, we're actually grabbing the sprite group because, you know, I'm trying to like, you want to avoid having to do this a lot. You know, you want to avoid, you know, like limit how many times you access memory. So for as many cases I can, we try to work within the context of integers and the Lua interpreter underneath the hood of everything, so we can just retrieve stuff, call functions, and do whatever. But anything involving graphics, we're going to have to do this kind of thing every so often. So oh no, we want to default to idle. What's the last thing we need to do here? We need to actually call it somewhere, right? So update entities damaged animation goes through, checks to see if you were damaged and if you were, do this. But here's the problem. This is going to mess up whatever the current, like, well, I think that's the point. But actually, if it's not damaged, because like if you start walking, we wouldn't want this to wipe out your current animation. So we might want to have to keep track of like a previous animation, or a previous like step that you were stepping in. So like over in sprite group, we would have to have like a previous right? So we probably wouldn't want like a default. Or maybe we do want a default and we also want a previous. So these are things I have to consider. I'm going to go and cut it here, because it is getting late. But as you can see, work is being done.